stick.
For your stick?
It's part of my whole thing. It's like a curved stick with a curved blade. Like farmers use it.
Oh, like a scythe.
Yeah, I'm looking for my scythe.
Oh well, I haven't seen any like real scythes around here anytime. But you are kind of in luck.
Huh?
Because we're reviewing the game Scythe today.
Scythe is an economic efficiency and area control game for 1 to 5 players, or up to 7 with the expansion. In Scythe, which is placed in a post-World War I but alternate universe, mechs run along the countryside next to peasants. Scythe is billed as a 3-point-something-X game, where you will definitely be expanding and exploiting, but you are going to be doing some kind of exploring and sort of exterminating. In a game of Scythe, your heroes will go on adventures. Your workers will collect resources. And your mechs will carry those workers around in addition to engaging in conflict with other pieces on the board. Scythe is a game about racing to claim objectives, and so whoever places the 6th star first is the player who ends the game. Scores are then calculated as a combination of popularity, territory, cash on hand, and the number of stars that you had placed throughout the game. The person who wins a game of Scythe becomes the claimant of the fabled factory region of this land.
The goal of Scythe is to have the most money at the end of the game. The main way you acquire money throughout the game is by taking bottom row actions on your player board. Each board has different level of gold for each of the bottom row actions.
For instance, the industrial board gives the most money for upgrading, but gives no money for enlisting.
The other way you gain wealth in this game is by doing various achievements in the game. You'll get money for every star placed, every territory controlled, and extra resources that you have. The efficiency with which you convert those things into money is controlled by the level of popularity that you have in the game. The higher you go, the more money you get for your achievements, and the more victory points you earn.
Each turn in Scythe, you must choose a column in order to determine what top and bottom row action you can take. The column you choose needs to be different than the one you chose in the previous turn. All of the top and bottom row actions are the same across all the player boards, but the combinations across them are different.
For example, on the industrial board, if I choose to trade, I can then choose to enlist afterwards. Whereas if I'm using the agricultural board, when I choose to trade afterwards, I can choose to deploy mechs.
You can see how your starting player board might modify your strategy as you play this game. Throughout Scythe, you can almost always, with very rare exception, take the top action of the board and resolve its effects. The bottom actions, on the other hand, require you to pay resources in order to gain their benefits.
The top row actions are as follows.
Action 1 is to produce. Choose several regions in which you have workers. Those regions are going to create resources. The more workers that you have, the more resources that you get. On the other hand, you have to pay additional power and popularity for the more workers.
Action 2, trade. Spend a gold to get 2 resources of your choice or to increase your popularity.
Action 3, move. You can move several units into an adjacent region. However, there are limitations on movement based on your current mech level. In addition, mechs can carry workers for additional efficient travel.
Action 4, bolster. Spend a gold to either increase your power or acquire combat cards.
The bottom row actions are as follows.
Action 1, upgrade. Pay oil in order to increase the efficiency of one of your top row actions and decrease the cost of one of your bottom row actions.
Option 2, spend metal to build a mech. You'll place a mech on the board which gives you that unit, but in addition, your hero and your mechs will all have an additional technological boost.
Option 3, build building. Pay wood in order to take one of your buildings and place them on the board. This building will also give you some special ability that increases the efficiency of one of your top row actions.
The last action is to hire a recruit. You spend food to get a small one-time bonus, but in addition, you choose a bottom row action, and every time you or your neighbors takes that action, you get an additional small incremental bonus.
The general tempo of the game is that you work to collect resources so that you can then take these bottom row actions, while at the same time working to increase your power and your popularity.
Throughout the game, you are aiming to place these stars, which not only give you a nice amount of endgame cash, but also push the game towards completion. Stars are placed for things like having all of your mechs on the board, all your buildings, all your workers, or for having maximum power or maximum popularity.
Ah! Max power! Game is over!
No.
But of course, a major part of the game is interacting with the map. Every space has a resource dedicated to it. There are also kind of other things going on. Like there are spaces on the board where when your hero moves into them, there are random encounters that take place, where you pull a random card and you choose one of 3 perks.
Plus, look at this really sweet art.
There's also a factory space in the middle of the board, which can give you a 5th action. And of course, there are other players on the board as well, with whom you can engage in combat.
Ah, charge! When you attack another player, you are allowed to play a number of combat cards equal to the number of mech units and hero tokens that you have in that space. In addition, you bid somewhere between 0 and 7 power secretly and simultaneously. I've got 5, 3, and 2 for 10.
I have 7 and 2 for 9.
No matter what, both of you will spend that power and it will go away. There's no way to get that back in the moment. The winner of the combat gets to place a combat star on that location, up where the stars are. In addition, the loser has to retreat all the way back to the home base. Any workers that are retreated lead to a loss in popularity for the winner because they displace those poor peasants. On the other hand, the victor does get to claim the spoils of victory, which are not only the location, but also the resources that are there.
When any player places their 6th star, the game immediately ends. At this point, money is distributed to players based on their level of popularity, and again, for territories, stars, and extra resources. Players then count up their money, and whoever has the most has successfully exploited the region the most and wins the game.
I've got 25.
Ah, 37.
At least I have a factory.
Alright, well let's dive in. What are your thoughts on interaction in this game?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we should talk about is the fact that you are racing to get 6 stars on the board, and so whoever gets those 6 stars first is the player who ends the game. They automatically have kind of a leg up because they're going to get those extra end-game points.
Yeah, I just don't know if I would consider that interaction, though, because the thing is, like, you're never going to block somebody else from using it, right? Anybody can work towards the same goals, and you're kind of doing that based on your engine and not necessarily because of other people. So it's a very, very indirect form of interaction at best.
Yeah, the stars are non-competitive, but there is actually kind of racing in this game that is strictly competitive, and that is getting the factory space or the adventure spaces before other players get there.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and that's like one of the main things that you're doing to interact with the board is that particular technology or space race, as I like to think about it, even though it's spatial. For sure. But you also can choose to ignore that in this game. As long as you're efficient in your other actions, you can choose to just not interact with that.
Yeah, that's true. But there is the combat action and the combat aspect of this game, and so that's clearly got to be interaction.
Yeah, but it's interesting, right? Like, if you're playing this game well, it really becomes more of a Cold War game as opposed to a Hot War game, right? As we mentioned, like, anytime you get into combat, you have to use your power as well as your combat cards, so you are using those resources, which take a lot to build up, and then you're making yourself vulnerable to other attacks. So really, you want to have enough power to seem formidable, but not use that power very much. I mean, maybe strategically once or twice in the game to be able to get the stars, but really not much more than that at all.
Yeah, for a game about mechs, you are not going to be fighting very often. I find that mechs are more for carrying people and for scaring other people than actually for fighting. And it is exactly what you said, that spending of power, it just makes you so vulnerable to other players. This game plays completely differently, I think, with 2 or maybe even 3 players compared to with 5 players. The 5-player game, there's just so many players in the middle of the board that you are always kind of chasing each other away. So you're really just doing that kind of stare down at each other. But you do have to very much attend to when you can be attacked. If you just rush some people out and then start producing a bunch of resources, somebody who doesn't care about losing popularity is going to come take advantage of you for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we didn't mention in the rules, but it's kind of important, is if you are have a situation where you just have a worker, anybody can walk in with their mech and claim that space. Then they get your resources, your worker is kicked out, without any combat having to ensue. And so that is kind of a precarious position to be in. But all those things being said, I do feel that when I'm playing this game, that the player interaction is fairly low, and lower than I would expect for the game based on its premise, right? Like, a lot of times I'm focused on, as I would in many other Euro games, building my engine and kind of looking at the board and what is, like, my most efficient move for my domain. And, I think defensively a bit, but I'm not necessarily overly aggressive or overly considering the other players.
And I will say, I think that that's a tax on new players in this game.
Mm-hmm.
I find a lot of times when I play with someone that is new, they'll realize this is an economic game and I'm focusing on my board and you'll be focusing on your board. And then suddenly, like, I'll come along and kind of exploit that. And then they're like, oh my god, I just got set so far back. But at the same time, if they come into the game saying, I'm going to fight people, like, they're obviously just going to lose because you can't just fight in this game.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Okay, Squid, so let's talk theme.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to say is this game is beautiful.
So pretty.
Right? I mean, like, these game pieces are lovely. There's a lot of character built into each group. With the encounter cards, there's lots of beautiful art, and, it says in the rules that you have to show all the other players the card and kind of describe the scene that's going on. So, like, there are these little aspects that are really beautiful in trying to, like, create that atmosphere, and that's something that I think that Stonemaier Games is kind of making their thing. I mean, their last game, Euphoria, was this like really fun dystopian game, had also a very like specific weird theme in the way that this is an alternate history theme, right? Like it's very specific and weird, and this is kind of what they're doing, and I think that they do it well in terms of the aesthetic of this game.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, like, right, the Norwegians or whatever, the Nordic kingdoms, have these, like, boat necks, right? And my guys, the Crimean Khanate, are just tractors with a gun stapled onto them. That's really funny. That's super cool. All the pieces are sort of, they're gorgeous in that way. And it even makes sense that there is that Cold War thing we just talked about, interaction. This is supposed to be after World War I. No European power actually wants to or even can get into a full-fledged conflict. So I even buy into that part of the game as well. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about the actual action-taking part of the game. So the majority of the game, I'm sitting here going, am I trading, am I bolstering, am I moving, am I producing? And it's, first of all, sort of weird that I can't produce 2 turns in a row. I'm not exactly sure, like, thematically what that's supposed to represent. Mm-hmm. And I am mostly just managing here, right? The stuff that we talked about that we love is the board. It's the pieces. And a lot of the game is in this, and then just kind of plopping my resources on the board. And so there is somewhat of a disconnect between the theme and your action taking.
Yeah, and I think that that's a very typical thing that Euro games tend to suffer from, right? Like, how do you integrate in these clever themes in that way? But I agree that, like, as you're playing this game, it's pretty to look at, but the theme feels pretty secondary.
Yeah, and you mentioned that thing before of it being a Euro game. I mean, I don't think that this is strictly a Euro game. It's sort of, it sits in one of those hybrid worlds, but it definitely leans Euro, and that I think you can kind of see in the fact that these actions are this and that. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'll say that makes this feel more Euro than sort of that Ameritrash category is that it is pretty rare in this that you have a story of I built up XYZ kind of empire because of the sort of efficiencies and kind of how tight this game is. It actually sort of prevents those stand-up die roll moments, those like, whoa, like everyone kind of knows how it is sort of going to play out. The one exception that I've had is the time where I've been like legislating happiness through my monument in order to produce every time, and that was really fun. Mm-hmm. But most of the time there are not a ton of stories associated with it.
Yeah, that's a really good point actually, and that's something that I generally really love about board gaming is kind of infusing those stories into the play, and it's something that I have never done in this game.
Yeah.
Which is a shame given the theme. Okay, so we've kind of hinted around this a little bit, but let's kind of dive in a little bit more thoroughly into the gameplay itself. Let's talk about these mechanisms.
Yeah, so this player board, which I just talked about being questionably thematic or not, is very tight. Mm-hmm. The actions all kind of make sense together. The whole upgrade thing of moving a piece from the top to the bottom is actually just like a really beautiful, elegant way of doing that, sort of making yourself more efficient. You feel like you're building something, and that's cool. I like that I can plan out, oh, I need some resources for this. If I produce this turn and then next turn I move and collect this, then I can then use those resources to build my building. That will allow me to then be more efficient in this other action. And so it's a very tight game in that way.
Yeah, and I do enjoy the number of action choices that you have, because it gives you enough variety, but it isn't overwhelming. The choices are things that feel familiar from other games, but are also unique enough that they feel fresh. And I think that there tend to be things that are, again, really easily picked up on just on the choices that you can do for new players.
Yeah, and a couple players per game are going to get those factory cards, which will then add some other fifth action, and sometimes those can be like, wow, I'm really going to kind of build my strategy around that. That being said, I kind of wonder if the mechanics in this game are actually almost too tight. What I mean by that is that I feel, I've played this game a handful of times now, and I feel like when I play this game with someone new, that they just cannot keep up with certain engines. I think that there are just like certain openings that you kind of, everybody almost goes for. I think that it's like pretty understood by most people at this point that like you're gonna build a bunch of workers, and if you don't, there's just no way to be as efficient. I'm sure that there are some other strategies maybe not using that. Actually, I'm not sure about that, but maybe there are. I always see people with more workers being more likely to win the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I think that there are some things that are just going to make it a frustrating game to play of people with different experience levels. And that's something that I've experienced as somebody who's played the game a few times, but not as many times as you. When I play with our game group who have played this game more than I have, I tend to be less efficient, and all of a sudden the game just ends, and there's not much that can be done about that.
Yeah, it's a game of inches until you kind of don't really realize maybe this was not the most efficient action. And we just played a game recently where my roommate Hammerhead and Squid and I were playing, and we were at the both of us were at 4, 5, or 6 stars, and Squid had like 1 in play, and that was, I mean, a really frustrating experience for you.
Yeah. And we debriefed after the game as to kind of what could be done more efficiently, and really it came down to just like not putting workers out early enough.
Yeah,
enough workers early enough.
Yeah, and the small edges just kind of they can really snowball in this game.
Yeah, and so the way the game ends with this 6 stars, the game immediately ends, can be kind of frustrating in how abrupt it is, and when you can see it coming in a lot of cases, or you know when one player is a couple stars ahead, and again this is almost the same end mechanism they use in Euphoria, and it's the same thing where you're trying to keep pace with other players and kind of keep that, but if you start falling behind, you just watch yourself not be relevant.
I personally just don't like the 6 stars or the 10 points in Settlers of Catan. I really hate that feeling of like that player went first, and so they're so much more likely to win the game than I am, because they're going to basically get an extra action for sure by the end of the game, and they didn't do anything to deserve that. They didn't do anything better with it. There's no advantage that I can have. One game where the different players sequence things actually lead for different strategies is like Turn and Toxis, and I enjoy that because being in the 4th seat actually means that you play the game a little bit differently. But there isn't really that aspect in this game. You're like, oh, I'm last player, so I know I'm going to get less actions. That just means you get less actions. There's no way to kind of play around that. Mm-hmm. But let's say that everybody is the same experience level, and then you kind of avoided that. What does the game look like then?
So I think, we kind of talked about how a lot of, particularly the starting strategies, tend to be really similar. People are kind of doing their own thing. And there's a lot of parts of this game, I mean, arguably the majority of this game are things that you have control over. But there are a couple of random elements that I would argue in this particular game are not helpful. They're, I generally like the balance of having some kind of random elements as well as the strategy, but here I think it really takes away from the gameplay. So the 2 ways that you really add randomness are, we didn't really talk about this, but you at the beginning of the game get 2 random objective cards that you can work towards, one of them, and then there's also the encounter cards that we talked about, which can give you random perks. And honestly, some are just stronger than others, and depending on when you get them, like for example, there's one that gives you a random mech early on in the game, in particular if like you are not a mech building person.
Yeah, if you're a Polania and stumble into an extra mech.
Right. It's a game changer.
Yeah, it can because of the snowballing aspect of this game, it can really blow things out of the water if everybody's kind of on that equal footing. And there isn't really a way to gang up in this game unless you guys all are really going to collude on that. It's probably not going to happen. And you mentioned the objective cards. Most of the time, one of your 2 objectives cards is pretty easy to complete, but it is a miserable experience when you can't complete either of them, or completing either of them really just takes you off of your kind of chain or path. You know, if you have a civilization that sucks at enlisting, which requires food, and one of your objectives is own farm spaces.
Right. I mean, yeah, and I do think that happens more often than not, and they can also be distracting, as you're kind of mentioning. I mean, they can be really, again, this is maybe an experience thing, but they can be a really big resource drag. You know, if you do end up with 2 choices that are just things that take so much energy. I mean, they're just not created equal in the same way that the random encounters are not created equal.
Yeah.
And so, because as we're talking about, this game is so tight, any little advantage or disadvantage is going to hurt you. You know, like there are some objective cards that just by doing what you need to do to play the game, you're gonna get that, right? So you get that star. You know, but then for other people that actually have to put the effort in, put the work in, it kind of shifts that balance.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the novelty and replayability.
Sure. I mean, definitely we can start with novelty. The theme itself, obviously, is something that's novel.
Yep.
We have talked about the limitations of that. I don't think that anything in terms of the mechanisms of the game are particularly novel, but they are interesting.
Yeah, so maybe not novel, but they are innovative. Like
Mm-hmm.
I do think that Jamie mentioned when he made this game, Jamie Stegmaier, who is the designer, mentioned that it's kind of an idea that he took some concepts from like Kemet, he took some concepts from Dune/Rex, and you can see those in this game, and Terra Mystica as well. But the way that he does some of the things, like I mentioned, the upgrade actions that I especially love, are nice. You know, they're put together in a neat new package, but not necessarily novel.
Yeah, agreed. And then, if we talk about replayability, I think, we've already kind of talked about how there are, in particular early in the game, very consistent strategies that you want to take. There are things that you want to do or you're pretty much out of the game. And that, to me, impacts replayability. I think, you do have the fun thing where there are different player boards that have, like, different combinations. You can play around with that. Different factions also have different strengths and weaknesses. You can kind of play around with that stuff, so that does increase the replayability. But I do think that does get mitigated by kind of how tight these mechanisms are and how they work.
Yeah, the big replayability is that like you are playing the different factions, right? And that's the part that's cool. I've played the expansion of this game as well, the Invaders from Afar expansion, and it's more of that. It's more different factions, but it doesn't change any of the gameplay itself. It's really like a mini expansion more than anything else. And I think that when you're talking about playing this game again, the question is, what kind of game player are you? If you're the kind of person that likes to play Euros and play with those little edges and things like that, I do think that this game is replayable because you play with something that's slightly different. Say, okay, can I make this efficient too, using more or less the same shell, using the workers and using the trading and so on and so forth. Where this is a game where like I'm going to be somebody with no popularity and just like make a ton of this or that or whatever. And so you can do that. But if you're somebody who's looking for like a vastly different experience, a kind of that Ameritrash story style experience, then it's not super replayable.
So, final thoughts. What do you think of Scythe overall?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So, Scythe is a game that I like. There was a lot of hype about it, and I kickstarted it, and I'm pretty happy with that. I've played it a handful of times. I know that I will play it again, and so I enjoy it. It's a game that I do like quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was kind of pulled into the hype, I gotta say, and I do enjoy the game. I don't think that it is necessarily worth all the hype. There's nothing about this game that feels so novel or so interesting, and I think that there are some drawbacks to the gameplay.
Yeah, it doesn't break any barriers, but it is just solid, and that's the thing with it. If you want to play a solid game, it will do that, but I don't think that it's gonna be like, wow, there's no other game like this. It doesn't have that aspect that some other games that get you really excited do.
Yeah, and as we talked about, I mean, the skill gap is going to be a problem. It's one thing if you introduce it to your game group, you only play with them, it's the same people playing, you grow into the game together. I think that's fine. But, as we know, that's generally not how gaming generally works. So that's going to be a limitation. You're going to have people that are frustrated playing this game.
Yeah, I think that skill gap thing is actually pretty large. That it's most fun when you're all playing and you're all new, or when you're all playing and you're all experienced. But it has some pretty lackluster experiences when some people know what they're doing and what they're not doing. I think part of the reason for that is that Scythe is not a game of unique engine building. It is a game about efficiency, and so you can't come away from a game and say, well, I lost, but at least I XYZ'd, because this game doesn't have XYZ. It is how efficient you were to get to the end, and that's why I like it. That's why it's solid. But there is not much of an experience for somebody who says, "Oh, I want to have accomplished this at the end of the game."
Right, and I think that, this ties back into what we were saying. So it depends on what you're looking for in a game. You're never gonna have wow moments with Scythe.
Yeah.
Which is another thing that's gonna happen. But that may not be what you're looking for. And if you are just into, thinking through your moves and like trying to be as efficient as possible, it's a great choice.
Yeah, and if you're looking for a game that is about managing resources, that is about managing your time and being very effective with your actions, where you have to be anxious about other players attacking you, and waiting to strike at a time that really can be perfect, that can make or break a game, then Scythe is a great choice. If you're looking for something that is explosive or going to lead to a very strange engine or something like that, this isn't that kind of game.
Definitely.
And I think a lot of things that we've seen in other reviews or people commenting online is people saying, oh, there's not enough fighting in this game, or there's too much fighting in this game. And it sits in a kind of weird hybrid space that you have to be pretty comfortable with. And so for me personally, it's actually in a really good spot, because I enjoy conflict in my games, but I actually also really enjoy Euro games. And so it sits just past that in a place where I really enjoy.
Yeah, and I think that's the combat aspect itself is another thing that, again, you have to know what you're walking into. If somebody describes this game to you and they focus more on the combat mechanism, you're going to be disappointed.
That's right.
But if you understand it, like as we've kind of described it as more of a Cold War style combat aspect, then it becomes interesting again, and you can think through how to play that most effectively.
Yeah, and it's possible that this is one of those games that the way your game group plays really influences your experience with the game. I've played with 2 different game groups and have found that this kind of tends to be the way. But I suppose I could see a world in which someone is just like going crazy, attacking each other all the time, like bluffing, double bluffing. But because of the way the victory points work with it, I'm not so convinced.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So that's our final comments and thoughts on Scythe. Thank you very much for watching our review.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Bye.